this week is the 2-year anniversary of Phillip Fulmer being replaced as a athletic director by Danny White. So I wrote a column in this on Off the Hook Sports, and if you want to check it out, we would love for you to. But we're going to pretty much break it down right here. So Phillip Fulmer ultimately, Caleb, we can both agree, is judged just like any athletic director in the SEC, with the exception of maybe Kentucky, and that is it's football, and then everybody else is kind of nice, right?
Right, exactly.
Okay, so we all know that Phillip Fulmer hired Jeremy Pruitt. Here's a situation where I don't think that Phillip Fulmer was tied in. I think a couple of people told him no. I think some people were afraid to work for a coach that was an athletic director. That was very common in the 70s and 80s, but it hasn't been in the decades more recently. And Phillip Fulmer was a guy that stepped in that the reputation was, be it fair or not, that he liked Phillip Fulmer maybe just a little bit more than the university. So he was going to look out for himself. So I don't know how many coaches told him no before Jeremy Pruitt finally said yes. But Caleb, I'll tell you this, I believe it was more than a couple. And I think you settled on Jeremy Pruitt. And you brought up a good point. Maybe he saw a little bit of himself in Jeremy Pruitt from a defensive perspective.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what it was. I think he may have been told no by a couple of coaches, but I think the profile of a couple of coaches was Jeremy Pruitt's profile. And I remember Phillip Fulmer in the press conference talking about. I remember him saying, being interviewed after Jeremy Pruitt's press conference, saying, talking about the toughness in the SEC and the intensity and stuff that kind of comes with a defensive coach. And I always said, like, offensive line coaches, like, that's the one position that if you're coaching, it's very similar to being a defensive coach, where it's all about the toughness and the line of scrimmage and, blue collar football or whatever. And I think Fulmer was very biased to that style. I knew when Fulmer got the job that, Tennessee was talking to Mike Leach. I knew there was no way Tennessee was getting Mike Leach at that point, because I know that Phillip Fulmer does not believe in any sort of creativity with offense. Like you said, he believes Jimmys and Joes over X's and O's all day, every day. And I think that I think Fulmer also saw, remember, that year was Kirby Smart's second year at Georgia, and Kirby Smart was going undefeated at Georgia, going to the national championship game. And I think he thought, oh, Jeremy Pruitt's the next Kirby Smart. Let's take a chance on him. And yeah, it was a bad hire. I think that doesn't mean it couldn't have worked out. You and I know there's some bad hires that sometimes work out. And
Sure.
but I think Fulmer went for the tough-minded defensive coach who can recruit at a high level. And I think you and I both agree, this was pre-NIL. Tennessee, given the fact that Georgia was dominant, Clemson was dominant, Alabama was dominant, they probably needed a creative offensive mind to stay ahead of the curve around that time, because they weren't just going to out recruit Georgia or Alabama at that time. And with defensive coaches, you got to be able to out recruit other guys, because defense is more about talent than scheming.
I agree with that. I also think that you're kind of looking at it from the perspective of who Phillip Fulmer wanted. He may have wanted Mike Leach, but you're probably right. He probably didn't. But it's the coaches that would have come under that circumstance. So I look at Danny White, who had success at Buffalo and Central Florida. And by comparison, here's a guy that if three people tell him no, he's got a fourth person on the list that he feels pretty confident with. I don't think Josh Heupel was necessarily the first choice at Tennessee coming from UCF. I think there were probably other guys. We'll never know. That's one of those things that never, ever gets released. But I don't know that Josh Heupel was the first choice, but that's fine. Maybe the first choice was Nick Saban to hire him away from Alabama just for conversational purposes. Okay, so he says no. Maybe the second choice is Kirby Smart to hire him away from Georgia for conversational purposes. However many people said no, however high you set your goals, it really doesn't matter, because on the next level down, you were able to get a Josh Heupel who had a very solid resume and who was a guy that you thought coming in had something a little bit different that would work in the SEC. So I don't care if that's your third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth choice on the list. You had that ready. Whereas Phillip Fulmer, what did he have ready? He had Jeremy Pruitt was his catch-all at the end of the day. And that was an incredibly bad hire. Be sure and hit that like button so we can bring more people in. If you haven't subscribed, we want you to do that. But the like button is fantastic because it brings more people into the conversation. Chuck saying it was his last choice to bring him in. I tend to agree with that. Comments from the message board brought to you by Zul Beer Company, xulbeer.com, worldwide award-winning craft beer. A great place to park downtown. You'll enjoy it. You'll love it. And we're going to have an event there really soon. Looking forward to that, the official craft beer of the Off the Hook Sports. So my point is, it's not Phillip Fulmer's fault that he took the position that was offered to him. As a matter of fact, it was somewhat natural. He was a consultant already. It's the administration's fault for offering it to him. You know, Phillip Fulmer, I think we would all agree, just like most of us, we want what's best for us. And then I think with Phillip Fulmer, second was what's best for the University of Tennessee. And I think he wanted to achieve both of those goals. And I think he thought he did with Jeremy Pruitt. But the bottom line is there's just not a guy that's going to be tied in like he was not if you don't have an administration background. You can't spend your whole life teaching young men how to play the offensive line and be expected to be tied in. I use the comparison of this. How tied in was Mike Hamilton when he hired Bruce Pearl? Nobody really knew who Bruce Pearl was at the time, but he was tied into basketball circles, maybe even more so than football circles. So you have to be tied into those circles, and you just don't snap your fingers and that happens. So I don't blame Phillip Fulmer for any of that. As far as the hire goes, maybe he did things to cover up for Jeremy Pruitt after. I don't know, but as far as his hires, and you look at them, it's Pruitt number one, and everybody else, and then Kelly Harper is kind of the last, kind of one of the last coaches that could have elite success, I believe, out of the group. Because if you look at who he hired, you've got Eve Rackham, who's done a fine job with the Lady Vols in the NCAA tournament. And then you have Brendan Webb, who has captured 7 tournament titles and 6 individuals in golf. But at the end of the day, he's going to be judged on Jeremy Pruitt and to a smaller extent, Kelly Harper. So he just was put in a position that there was no way he was going to have elite success. No way.
I agree. And one of the things that, and you're right, when it comes to being tied in, there's understanding the nature and the structure of your program and what you're going for. One of the things that Danny White understands very well is that if you look at his hires, and Danny White's very big on this everywhere he's been, he doesn't hire a guy and say we're looking to build this program up in 3 years. He hires a guy that he knows can make a splash the first year he's there. Danny White's and I actually kind of believe this is the way to hire too. If you're at a place like Tennessee and you're a program that's on fire like Tennessee was in 2021, his philosophy was, I need a guy that's going to make a splash the very first year, that's going to really invigorate the fan base, and that's going to help not just with ticket sales and important stuff like that, but that is going to help with recruiting. Because as you know, this you make a first year splash, that the snowball kind of starts. Look at the first year splash Bruce Pearl made when he was hired, and yes, Josh Heupel went 7-6, but I think we all agree going 7-6 and given what Tennessee was expected to do, that was a first year splash. That was a huge deal that happened, and I think that Danny White knew that, and I don't think a football coach from the 90s who believes X's and O's, Jimmy's and Joe's over X's and O's is really going to approach it from that perspective. And
No, I agree. And I think the Dave Clawson hire in 2008 was clearly an indication that Phillip Fulmer still wanted to be involved, that Phillip Fulmer, he was going to have a say. I remember the stories of Phillip Fulmer showing up to practice, which technically was an NCAA violation, but he showed up to Jeremy Pruitt's practice. And imagine Caleb, you had an editor or somebody with your positions, and they're looking over your shoulder the entire time. I don't care if they're supportive and they're telling you you're fantastic. That is, at the end of the day, going to affect your performance. I firmly believe that. Chuck said it was Fulmer's last choice to bring him in. Totally agree with that. Now, Travis says something that is intriguing to me. Anyone was better than Schiano, therefore Pruitt was accepted. Now, there obviously was the Schiano mess with the Penn State thing, but to this day, it hasn't been proven um, that he had any knowledge of the atrocities that were going on at Penn State. And I would offer this too. Schiano at the time was a much better candidate. Now we've seen what's happened since. Much better candidate than Pruitt. We would all agree with that, right?
Um, we have to remember, I don't think it was just the Penn State thing with Schiano, if I'm going to be honest with you. I think that we all know if Nick Saban had if Nick Saban had the loose tie to the scandal that Schiano had, nobody would have cared. I think it was a combination of that. Schiano's resume wasn't, I mean, he had a 1-11-2 season at Rutgers with Ray Rice, but the minute, he lost it. Remember this. Tennessee had just fired Butch Jones. Schiano got blown out by Butch Jones when he was at Rutgers in like 2011. And there were also some stories of him being a bit of a snake when he was in the NFL. I mean,
he was a snake in recruiting too. I don't doubt that at all. I think a lot of the coaches are snakes, but as far as a resume as a head coach in the NFL compared to Jeremy Pruitt, never been a head coach anywhere. I mean,
I agree.
Coming in the door, I mean, that if the Penn State thing didn't exist, which I think was a bit.
They tried. Also, let's not forget though, John Curry tried to sneak the Schiano hire in at a time when nobody was paying attention. It was like on a Sunday during the NFL. It was very clear that he was trying to sneak in the Schiano hire before the press could really get a hold of it and do anything. And the reason he was trying to do that is because, one, let's just call it what it is. The Haslams were pulling his strings, and they loved Jimmy Haslam for some reason, loved Schiano.
Yep.
And it was because they knew it was going to be a letdown because the fans wanted John Gruden first, which I think they dodged a bullet not getting John Gruden. And they wanted Dan Mullen second. But because Curry was so late firing, and we know this, he was so late firing Butch Jones that Florida was already talking with Dan Mullen, and there was no way Tennessee was going to get him at that point. And that whole fiasco goes back to Tennessee took way too long to fire Butch Jones. We all knew he was a disaster of a coach by September of that year, and they didn't fire him until the end of October.
No, agreed. And I thought that the Schiano move was a little bit sneaky. I don't know why they fell in love with him. I don't know why they felt like they had to do it on a sneaky level. Did they worry about the Penn State issues? Perhaps. As far as Dan Mullen, you talk about Tennessee not moving quick enough. Had they moved quick enough? Now, I still think Dan Mullen's a pretty good coach.
I do too.
But had they gotten Dan Mullen, they would have had to move quickly because they moved slowly, and then Florida got involved, and then it was over. Kind of similar to the way South Carolina was going to hire Kirby Smart, and Georgia said, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, we can't miss out on this guy." I don't know if you remember that story, but the South Carolina was ready to move on Kirby Smart, and so yeah, Tennessee just didn't have great options after 2, 3, or 4. I don't know who their 2, 3, or 4 were, but I guarantee you Jeremy Pruitt wasn't 1, 2, or 3.
Wouldn't it have made more sense for Fulmer at that point to and if given what we know about Pruitt and given that he was a questionable hire at that point, wouldn't it have made more sense just to excite the fan base by hiring Team Martin as head coach and let him bring in a great staff to run the show? I mean, I'm not saying Team Martin would be a great coach. I'm just saying if you were going to make the uninspiring hire in Pruitt, at least Team Martin's a good recruiter.
I think in both cases you're talking about a carryover coach, a stability coach. Is that basically what you're saying? You're saying a stability coach to get you to the next coach who hopefully wins at the championship level. I mean, yeah, I mean, I guess I could see that. I haven't been told by anybody in coaching circles that T. Martin's ready for that type of position or even necessarily ready to run an entire offense. But yeah, I mean, you could make that argument. You could make a lot of arguments over Jeremy Pruitt or you could make a lot of arguments over Greg Schiano.
Because that's definitely what Tennessee should have done in 2010 with Kippy Brown. They
No
should have
question.
definitely made him head coach.
No question. It was fantastic the way they interviewed him after they had hired Derek Dooley. That was really high class. Sarcasm.